So that was extraordinary and I think very brave effort in Russia in that period, post-Soviet Russia, to try to get some economic sense into the new rulers of Russia, to prevent the land and natural resources all going to the oligarchs. Although, of course, a great deal of it did, the very fact the effort was made must have left a mark on people in Russia, I'm sure, and sets an outstanding example of how we should all show similar courage, I think, in campaigning for economic justice. I've no idea what Fred's going to say. He always says something surprising, so I'll leave it to Fred.
Thank you. Yeah, so as a result of that 10 years, I had to sit back and reflect deeply on what was going on, because the outcome was a total disappointment. What happened was that all the rental value of an extremely rich continent, a huge landmass, was handed over to a relatively few people. And the main responsibility for that was with Western governments, Brussels and Washington and London, that worked tirelessly to make sure that the people didn't get their way. The people, on the whole, as far as one could detect, were extremely sympathetic to what my colleagues and I were advocating over this 10-year period. We went back consistently to push the proposal and to educate the people, and we had the Academy of Sciences on our side, the economics department. The highest academicians could understand the sense of what we were saying, and organizations like the Union of Russian Cities passed resolutions endorsing the idea that public funding should come from the rents of the natural resources. And people who responded to the radio and TV phone-ins that my colleagues and I undertook expressed direct sympathy. It resonated with them. So if there was democracy, they would have done it. But there isn't democracy. And after 10 years, I had to stop and think, well, there was no point in going on. And so I began, that was in about 2002, and I had to start reflecting deeply. So what I'm going to say today is the consequence of the following 10 years of reflection and research into the fundamentals of our society and culture. The outcome is that I'm not now an advocate of land value taxation. I do not now advocate land value taxation. I will report people saying land value taxation, and say if I make a video and interview somebody and that's their language, of course I will include it in the video. But I myself do not now advocate land value taxation, and I'll explain why. Quite obviously I'm not here under fraudulent pretenses, so you must assume that I'm not disaffiliated from the philosophy that you all subscribe to. But I had to think through what turned out to be 40 years of just about full-time sustained campaigning. And when I gave up full-time employment, it was indeed full-time, excessively. It was 7 days a week, more or less 24 hours a day, working at this thing. So I had to figure out why the results were actually not zero, but actually negative. When you look back over the last 4 generations, you see that the public awareness of the doctrine of economic justice, seen from the Henry George point of view, has diminished. The scale of collection of rents in this country and in others has diminished. The weight of support in favour of alternative policies, as advocated by academics and those who recommend policies to governments, has increased. So there's been a net loss of support over the last 4 generations of what was sustained commitment by a lot of people who work for their basically their whole lives, trying to explain a policy that ought to be the centerpiece of governance. So the question for me was, why? Why were we failing? And really there was no other important question to be considered other than that. Because I was reluctant to give up, but on the other hand, when you know that you've been knocked on the floor, you don't get up unless you feel that you can stay on your feet. Otherwise you may as well lay down rather than keep being pummeled. We now have to come to terms with the fact that we are advocating something that's non-negotiable. Nobody in a position of power in our society, whether that power is through politics or academia, the civil service, the media, will countenance serious consideration of what we're proposing. And that's because the culture that has enveloped our society is more or less exclusively devoted to the need to preserve the privatization of rent. So you see, I then came to the odd conclusion that it was pointless trying to talk to, say, members of Parliament about the need for fiscal reform, because they do not have the power to execute that one reform. Most of them don't understand why they don't. So I'm not accusing most of them of bad faith. It's just that once you become embedded in the structure of power, you are more or less a cipher, a dummy. And yes, you can achieve huge things by way of laws and altering the fabric of society. But the one thing you cannot touch, the one subject that's taboo, is the one that we're advocating. I should have realised that very early on, because back in the early 1970s I was a Liberal parliamentary candidate. I made a serious attempt at getting into Parliament, and after the first failed attempt, I realised that actually, even if I were elected, I would have no power in Parliament to do what needed to be done. So I figured, well, I better stay outside, assuming that there was any real chance of getting elected, and try and influence things from the outside. So I did continue as a picture candidate for the next couple of elections, just to qualify for the 3 weeks off from my employer so that I can work in party headquarters. But I wasn't a serious candidate on the hustings because for the reason I've just given. I should have figured out from that there was no point subsequently in trying to engage with members of Parliament on this one issue, for the reason I've already given. And yet, the tradition of campaigning was such that I slipped into the mode that had been the practice, the behaviour of the previous 3 generations of Georgist activists, and sought to apply reason to negotiate change by trying to talk to people in influential positions who might be able to use their positions to spread the good news in order to effect change. But I'd already figured out in the early 70s that that was a pointless exercise. So why did I then continue from the outside to make the mistake that I knew was a mistake? Because, as I say, there was no alternative available to campaigners, and I accepted the precepts of our system, which is we're a democracy, that reason applies, that you have to put the case in a level-headed, objective way and fight for the change that needs to be effected, which 3 previous generations had done with the results that I've already basically described. So it was all pointless. And I now have concluded that actually trying to negotiate change with people who occupy positions of influence in the power structure is pointless. Having reached that conclusion, of course, I then had to come up with, well, what is the alternative? Because one cannot abandon a moral cause. But on the other hand, all of history indicates that trying to apply reason with those in positions of power doesn't work. And those people would rather see their societies collapse rather than accept good advice. I cite 3 examples at the back of the Traumatized Society, where people of substance, ordinary folk like me, went to those at the top of the system and said, look, the conditions for revolution, social upheaval exist in this land, and the only way to deal with it is to incorporate what we're talking about. And they didn't. And the result was revolution and many, many people dying as a consequence. The pattern repeats itself so often. So I then look back in the history of civilizations, and sure enough, the one cause of the demise of civilizations is the privatization of rent, which, when it gets to a point where it's irreversible, means that there is no hope for that civilization. Well, that raised some terrible, burdensome questions for me, and I don't have the time to go into any detail, but I ended up reaching the conclusion that on the present trajectory of our society, and by our society I mean our, what is a globalized civilization, the next World War is a foregone conclusion. There must be another World War, because that's in the nature of the system that we inhabit, and that our civilization has probably reached the tipping point. I don't know whether the system, the downward slide is reversible or not. When civilizations end, it doesn't happen in a few years or even a few decades. In fact, you can chronicle the decline of a civilization over centuries, but once you see the pattern, it's quite clear that the momentum is gathering pace, and that those people who lived, whether it was Greece, Rome, the ancient civilizations, they'd reached a point where there was no going back, and their civilization would end. And when I sought to apply that to our civilization, I had to come to the grim conclusion that the Western civilization, the European civilization, is on a trajectory downwards, and I don't know whether it can be reversed or not. Nonetheless, one has to try. Which comes back to the question of, well, if those in power won't do anything to reverse the process of cultural degradation, the decadence in the fabric of society, what do people do about it? How do you change the course of history? And so that's the question, the primary question that preoccupies me. I now want to read, because I'd like to get the words precise, a little statement to you, and then I'll revert to talking once I've read this, because I'd like to spell it out quite clearly to you, okay? The property rights we have today were not sanctioned by God, or by science, or by the common law of the people. Those property rights were seized and secured by a class within society that was operating under the norms of a culture of cheating. That cheating deprived the people of their ancient common law rights of access to the land they needed to sustain their lives. To soothe their consciences, that class enacted laws in a parliament that excluded the people from its membership. The people had no right to elect those people who sat in the House of, quote, Commons, who sat in the House of Commons even though they were the people of the Commons. They had no right to elect their own to the House of Commons. The House that designed the property laws also consequentially determined two new realities: the distribution of the nation's income and the statecraft of the kingdom. The aristocracy, the feudal barons and knights, reshaped statecraft, a statecraft that was based on monopoly power and greed. So the institutions that we have today, the legacy, Parliament, the so-called rule of law, the democratic process, the administrative institutions, are all functions of a statecraft of greed. And that greed was just taking what others produced and consuming it on the basis of the monopoly power that the aristocracy exercised. The people who shaped the culture of England and then the major institutions of the kingdom were just a few people, the feudal aristocracy. That aristocracy went rogue on the people whom they had sworn to protect through their fealty to the crown. The rogues in ermine fabricated an ideology to sanctify their need for legitimacy. They had to persuade themselves first, and then the rest of the people, that what they were doing was legitimate. And for that they needed an ideology that covered up what they were doing. And that ideology is what we today accept as normal, natural, and which we actively support and retail to the rest of the world. The former Soviet countries, the countries of Africa, we're trying to embed it in China now. Their culture of cheating had to be camouflaged, so they wrapped their skullduggery in the ritual of lawmaking in a parliament that was a sham. A sham that is, if it was intended to represent the interests of everyone in the kingdom. A sham that is, if it was intended to represent everyone in the kingdom. The people of the Commons did not sign up to the property rights that condemn so many of them today to premature death. If a child is born in Blackpool today, it will die something like 12 years earlier than children born in the southeast of England, on average. And that is because of the culture that we have been lauding as that which other countries should emulate. So our culture is a killing culture. First, there must be a democratic mandate for reform if the question is, what is to be done? We need a democratic mandate for reform. The people need to assert their right to debate and write a new social contract. To achieve this, the people in general need to engage in a participative form of democracy. That would enable them to freely determine the terms of the new social contract. Then they need to assume control of the House of Commons, to affirm the legitimacy of the social contract as the mandate representing the interests of those whose ancestors were unceremoniously thrown off the commons of England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales. So I'm saying that we are now being ruled by an unwritten constitution that is not legitimate, it's not authentically the people's, and it's time now that the people themselves serve notice, not on any one individual or class of people, but to the culture that that incorporates us, that the time has come to change, that we do not respect that culture, and that the people themselves have to now rewrite the rules of the game. Okay, so how are the rules to be rewritten? Well, it has to start with the people. And that means we have to find a new way of articulating what we stand for. And that's why I can no longer say to anybody, look, what we need is land value taxation. Land value taxation is one of the obstacles to achieving what we want. It's not the primary one, so I'm not putting the blame on the 4 generations of activists, that includes me, who spent their lives advocating land value taxation. The main obstacle has been the culture that would simply never countenance a restoration of the fiscal system that emancipated people. But we keep shooting ourselves in the foot every time we say what we need is land value taxation. Now I know that from personal experience because I've had 30 years of advocating it strenuously and directly to members of parliament, journalists, people in the street, and so on. And I monitored their reaction, and I now understand that actually I was screwing myself by advocating land value taxation. I'll come to the word tax in a second, but if you deconstruct the concept of land value taxation, what you find is this. Land. We focus everything on restoration of birthrights in land. Land rights. Afraid that's one of the phrases that certainly our American colleagues use. They want restoration of land rights, birthright in land. Well, yes, but that's less than half of the story. When the aristocracy took the land, they took society, they took culture. They wanted the land not because they wanted the land, but the revenue from the land, and that revenue is what is needed to fund culture and society in general. So when they captured the land, when they displaced people from the land, they displaced them from society, in many cases physically so. Bugger off, go to the wilds of North America where there are a few Indians, or to Australia, but you are now outside our society. So actually what we need is a restoration of our right of access to society, not just land, but by remaining almost totally silent on society, we left the space for socialists to move in after Karl Marx. They occupied it and they screwed it up, as we've seen in Eastern Europe and all the way to China. So we should be talking about the restoration of society to the people as well as land. So land by itself is only less than half the story. Land value. When we talk about land value, we are explicitly acknowledging that the land value is yours. The rents are yours, because if we're saying we're going to tax your land value, so we're affirming it is yours, then people are entitled to say, yes, it's mine, and how dare you want to tax it? So we undermine the moral case for fiscal reform by acknowledging that land values are a legitimate target for taxation. Every time we say your land value has gone up, whatever it is, and we're going to tax it, people are having reinforced in their minds, yes, it is my land value. So we're defeating ourselves every time we acknowledge land value. And then the word tax is totally wrong from the point of view not just politics and psychology. People react as if you've just given them a sharp injection of electricity when they hear that you want to tax them. taxing their land, their hard-earned property values. You know, the Daily Mail's hard-working middle-class homeowner, the land value is their hard-earned value, and we want to tax it. And by the time you get around and say, of course we want to reduce the taxes, oh yeah, well, we've heard that before, we don't trust the politicians, they're not going to reduce other taxes, forget it. So I've wasted my time talking to someone trying to sell land value taxation. So a new language is needed to explain what is going on, and I don't have the time to go into any detail, but the narrative is very simple. We don't want to tax you, except in certain cases, what are called the sin taxes, where you need to accept responsibility for what you are doing, and therefore we have no choice but to tax you. An example is, there's so much cancer in this society, and it's caused by, a large part of it, by cigarette smoking, and so why should the rest of us pay for your cancer treatment? We have to tax tobacco to fund the hospital care of people with cancer. That's a tax that's entirely legitimate. But as a rule, we want to get rid of all taxes. Oh yeah, well that sounds good. We're with you up to this point, but they then ask the question, well, but how are we going to pay for public services? So now they are wanting to engage in a discussion constructively, because they, although they don't like taxes, they certainly want public services. So, okay, yeah, well, the answer to that is not to say, well, we want to tax your land values, because then they think, oh gosh, my house has gone up in X value and now this guy wants to tax. No. The next thing is, look, people need to pay for the benefits that they receive from society. Well, yeah, that sounds reasonable, because we are not into cheating. We don't like cheats. We condemn cheating. And so if you're saying that what we should do is meet our personal responsibilities, pay the personal cost of the services that each of us actually wants to incur through the services that we want to be provided by our government, then we should pay for them. But don't we already pay for them through our taxes? Yes, but we want to get rid of those. Oh, so then how would we pay for them? Well, you decide how you pay for them. You want to live in the middle of Oxford, a lovely location. You want certain services, don't you? Well, yeah, of course we do. And well, we pay for them, don't we? Yes, but you pay the wrong people, don't you? The estate agent who sold you your house said, look, there's access to this wonderful hospital in Oxford and great schools here, and you've got fast access to London, so the price of this house is £500,000. Why did you pay the person who was selling the house to you for these services? Shouldn't you be spending that money on funding those services directly? Well, yes. Okay, well, that's all we're saying, that you should be paying directly for the services you receive, rather than in this botched way of doing it, indirectly through taxes that suppress the economy, that discriminate against people, that creates poverty, that actually causes premature death of, well, 50,000 people in this country, or England and Wales alone, according to the one estimate that I have, just because of the tax regime. Well, that's the sort of narrative that at least gets people talking, because what one can show is that our present approach is based on cheating. I'm a cheat. I have not paid for all the services that I have received from the public sector, and I can measure the benefits that I've received by the increase in the value of the location that I occupy. Well, this Daily Mail's middle-class, hard-working homeowner does not like cheats. Benefit cheats, they actually find anathema. And it turns out that we're all, or most of us, are cheats. And we would like to get rid of cheating in our society, or that's the choice. People need to be confronted with the choice. We can carry on cheating, creating the disturbances, stuck with a tax regime that we say we don't like, or we can start to do something about it. To do something about it, we need to take control of our lives. We need to stop falling for the language of the rule of law is what we abide by, the democratic system that we sell to other peoples, the state as being somehow benign and powerful and on our side. It ain't so. It's all a fabricated myth designed to keep us all compliant, dependent. How do we get people motivated? That's the practical issue that now concerns me. We don't do it through the political parties, they can't. We can see what Vince Cable says. I support this thing, but don't expect me to make the point in any speech that I make while a member of the government. And they struggle to make it even from the backbenches. And I can't blame them, because they are, as I said earlier, ciphers. They're put in there to occupy posts where they are dummies required to maintain the system at all costs. And that includes crucifying people just to keep the system going. The austerity program is a process of crushing our communities and people's lives just in order to sustain the system as it is. We only talk about the need for fiscal reform, but the debate has to incorporate monetary reform, because rents don't just fizzle out to people who own land, they go to the banking sector in a great measure, as well as others. But the point of mentioning the need for addressing the rents that go to the banking sector issue is that the austerity program today, which is crushing people's lives and communities, is dedicated to preserving the system that channels rents to the financial sector, to keep the financial sector viable, unchanged. They're talking about regulating the banks. That will make no difference at all to the future trends, the next recession, which, if it fits the timetable of the 18-year cycle, will happen in about 5 years' time. That's the mid-cycle recession before the big one, which will terminate in 2028. Nothing of that's going to change. It's business as usual. So all that we're seeing about forcing people out of their social housing because they've got an extra bedroom that's deemed to be surplus to their personal requirements, all that kind of stuff is in order to preserve the way the nation's income is redistributed.